So before that, we'll just start, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم أخرجني من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمني بنور الفهم. اللهم افتح علينا أبواب رحمتك وانشر علينا خزائن علومك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. So inshallah, I pray you're all well. My name once again is Farhan Ali. Before we get started, I just request you all to, inshallah, recite Surah Al-Fatiha preceded by salawat for Marhum Sayyid Asad Jafri as well as all of our Marhumin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So inshallah, last week we mentioned that we'll be continuing with the explanation of verses 2 and 3 of Surah Al-Anfal. And I apologize in advance. Once again, you'll have to put up with me for a short period of this session. As mentioned last week, it's sort of a tradition to begin such sessions with the kalam of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. So once again, I'll start with a short hadith. I'll just mention it and roughly translate it. This hadith is directly related to today's discussion. So maybe just keep it in mind, inshallah, once we get to the similar words in our discussion. It's narrated in Irshad al-Qulub, volume 7, page 78. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was asked about the beginning of verse 121 of Surah Al-Baqarah, which is الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَتْلُونَهُ حَقَّ تِلَاوَتِهِ. Basically, it means those to whom we have given the book, recite it as it ought to be recited. So after which the Imam says, they read the verses or signs and gain deep understanding of them, and they act based on what is commanded to them. So here we can see there's a direct relation between talawa and the word that the Imam uses is يتفقهون. He says يرتلون آياته ويتفقهون فيه ويعملون بأحكامه. So basically that there's a deep understanding, there's a connection here between tilawa and tafaqquh. Tafaqquh comes from the same root as fiqh, which means deep understanding. So these letters make up the word fiqh, which basically means deep understanding. Inshallah, we'll talk more about tilawa and also differences between tilawa and qira'ah later on in today's session. So alhamdulillah, just a quick review of what we went through in yesterday's session. It was إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ in last week's session, not yesterday. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ. Certainly the believers are only those who, whenever Allah is mentioned, and it's sort of just, we left it there in the middle of this condition. So we're continuing today with the second part of the condition of what needs to occur whenever dhikr of Allah takes place. And this needs to occur for a mu'min, basically. Can anyone tell me the three types of dhikr that we mentioned last week?
Zikr of the heart, zikr qalbi.
Yeah, that's one of them, definitely.
And then I think zikr amali.
Yeah, there's one more.
And I'm just trying to.
That's good. Alhamdulillah, 2 out of 3. Does anyone else remember the last one?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Dhikr lafzi.
Yeah, lovely. Ahsan. Hassan. So thank you. So now, inshallah, we'll continue with the lesson and see what the condition of this first trait out of the five traits that are mentioned in these two verses, what the condition is that is necessitates iman, and it's also necessitated by iman. So the next word in continuation of this verse is wajilat, which has been translated as tremble. However, this is actually to tremble is actually the result of wajilat rather than a direct translation. Oftentimes, when translating a word, especially from Arabic, we have to make do with using the word describing it rather than the word itself. So describing its result rather than using the word itself. So this is common with Arabic words, as the meaning of each word can be quite sort of detailed and precise. So instead of using a whole sentence to describe what this word means, we just use basically the result, like what that whole meaning, what it results in. So wajilat is actually, it can be described as being full of, like so full of fear or awe that this sensation, this feeling is about to spill out over you. And the intensity of this awe and fear is actually what results in one trembling. So trembling, but keeping in mind that it's due to this sort of intensity of awe and fear inside one. So now one can be full of this feeling due to various reasons. Let's go through a couple of examples, inshallah, to get a better idea of this word. So imagine a person being guilty of an action, is sort of trembling while standing before the judge and awaiting a sentence, while knowing that the judge is aware of his guilt. So this would be an example of trembling out of fear, and wajilat could be used for this as well. Now imagine a mountain climber who reaches the top of a peak and takes in the beauty of creation from a perspective which is basically far more inspiring than anything he has previously observed. He's trembling out of awe in the face of something that's out of extreme greatness and beauty. So this is basically the meaning. The second meaning is closer to what is meant here in the ayah. Trembling due to this overwhelming feeling inside can also be rooted in love as well, as another example. Maybe trembling out of longing for a loved one who's passed away due to the void created when, for example, a parent or especially a mother passes away. So being full of this overwhelming feeling, which leads to trembling due to the dhikr of Allah, due to witnessing the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is out of awe of his greatness and grandeur, and ideally out of sort of a longing for proximity to him. And he is basically, this should also be rooted, although it is awe of his greatness and grandeur, it can also be sort of rooted in love as well. So this actually, it reminds me of a story that one of our teachers told us about Allama Tabatabai, which is relevant to our discussion. And basically, Allama, he was walking with a student through a garden or an orchard of sorts. For anyone who's been to Qom recently, you're probably thinking that there's not many gardens or orchards, but just maybe 50, 60 years ago, before our lifetime, but not too long ago, the majority of what was seen in Qom was basically orchards and gardens. To all these buildings and houses weren't here past a certain point. So it wasn't too uncommon to be in such a setting in Qom. Anyway, so the student was following him, and he noticed that his teacher had all of a sudden stopped. He saw that his teacher was right in front of a leaf on a branch, which was obstructing his path. When he moved around to see why his teacher had stopped, instead of continuing, he saw that his teacher's face was sort of, it was wet from tears, and tears were constantly flowing down Allama's face. This is a very high level, an example of being in awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's dhikr, basically his creation. Allama, when he came face to face with this leaf, he saw so much in it and saw how it is a dhikr amali. It's something, it's a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's how he understood how it was reflecting Allah. And out of that, he was in such awe just from being face to face with this leaf. He had attained this sort of advanced understanding and high level of iman through seeking proximity to his Lord. So inshallah, before we'll move on to the next word, inshallah. قُلُوبُهُمْ, their hearts. So قُلُوبُهُمْ is translated as their hearts. As we mentioned in the previous session, the use of إِذَا was to put forth a condition. The first part of the condition was ذُكِرَ Allah, which we mentioned last week, which was translated as whenever Allah is mentioned, or more precisely, we could say whenever one witnesses an instance of his dhikr, whether it be lafzi, qalbi, or amali. Now this sentence is completing the condition by saying that it is their hearts that tremble. So whenever one witnesses an instance of his dhikr, their hearts tremble. So the first trait being connected to the mu'minun in this verse is that whenever one of the mu'minun witnesses an instance of Allah's dhikr, his heart is so full of awe due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's greatness and grandeur that it trembles. It's so full of awe, is so full that it's like a glass of water that's it's full to the top. It's about to spill out. So this awe basically that is so full of leads to this tremble in the mu'min. The use of the word hearts here is indicative of a quality which is deep-rooted, as opposed to being superficial. Empty words and lip service they're not enough when our hearts are being penetrated by something. It is based on experiential knowledge, which I believe you guys discussed in C1 when you covered 2 ways to study something using the example of the sun. As most of us probably know, the word for heart is qalb, and qulub is its plural form. The hum added to the end of qulub here is what links these hearts that are being mentioned to the mu'minun. It's what tells us these are the hearts of the mu'minun. The hum takes the word qulub back to mu'minun. So those whose identity, which we talked about before, is sort of intertwined with iman, are the mu'minun. Hence, it is the hearts of those who possess an ongoing, deep, and profound connection with belief and faith. It is only natural for the heart of such individuals to react by trembling out of awe when witnessing his adhkar, as this occurs through the presence of understanding in the heart. If one is just going through life on autopilot mode and not paying attention to the sort of intricacies and complexities of creation as they go through life, they end up sort of preventing such awe to manifest in their hearts. So presence of the mind is definitely a requirement in any situation where you're trying to appreciate something, and a level of focus is needed, which is sort of dependent on the complexity of what you're trying to appreciate. So here, when you're trying to appreciate the signs of Allah and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself, obviously a very high level of focus and a presence of mind would be required. Hence, spending life in a sort of robotic routine and on this autopilot mode can be poisonous for anyone who is actually seeking proximity to their Lord. Moving on to the second trait, which was linked to the mu'minun, the verse continues, وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا. And whenever his verses are recited to them, they increase their faith. So now right from the beginning of this sentence, you must notice some similarities to the previous word in this verse. Can anyone tell me how the way that this trait is being mentioned is similar to how the previous one was mentioned? but they're both basically starting with وَإِذَا. And this means that they're both traits that are being conveyed and stated. Yeah, there's a cause and effect relationship. That's right, Hassan. Yeah, so they're both basically stating conditions. They both follow the same format of causality. So basically, if X happens, then Y is the result of it. So let's look at the individual words of this sentence. Starting with وَإِذَا, we won't spend too much time here. Wa basically means and we went through إِذَا previously. It's connecting the previous, the wa basically here is connecting the previous sentence to the one which is going to follow. So it's connecting what's before wa to what is after, similar to and in English. And to show that it basically shows that they're still both explaining both of these conditions, both of these traits are explaining إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ. As mentioned previously, إِذَا is what indicates the condition is going to follow it. Hence, it has been translated as whenever. So tuliyat, this is a word which most of us have probably heard some version of before. The root letters are ta, lam, and waw, which is the same root as as the word tilawa. So once again, following the same pattern as before, tuliyat as the same passive past tense version of the word, just like dhukira. As you can probably see, as you notice, that they share the same pattern of harakat. So this means that they're both in the passive past tense. And basically, just a reminder, using the passive form of the verb indicates that it's the action itself, inshallah, which holds importance here rather than who is doing it, which we mentioned before when we talked about dhukira. So our focus here is understanding this action. The who is doing it is not important at all. Typically, the word tilawa is translated as recitation, most commonly. However, this is not entirely correct. It is correct to a certain extent. Tilawa actually means not just to recite, but after that recitation, to also ponder upon what was said. And also, basically, what we mentioned in the hadith, the word the same root was used in the hadith, the same root of tilawa. And when they asked the Imam about this, he said that basically that a deep understanding and an action based on that deep understanding needs to come about, and that's what is meant by using this word in the verse. It was verse 121 of Surah Baqarah. So essentially, tilawa is a combination of these two actions, to recite and to ponder, and in this specific order as well. If the action which was intended was just to recite, the passive tense of qara'a would have been used, which is quri'a. Basically, qara'a, I think most people have probably heard qira'at as a word which is common. So this would have been used because the root letters qaf, ra, hamza, qara'a, it indicates recitation without necessitating pondering afterwards. So if anyone is interested, the word quri'a has been used twice in the Holy Quran. Interestingly, just like in our discussion here, the word quri'a in both instances where it's used is being used after وَإِذَا as a part of a condition in both instances. Once in Surah Al-A'raf, which is chapter 7, verse 204, it says وَإِذَا قُرِئَ الْقُرْآنِ, and whenever the Quran is recited. So here, recited is, we can just leave it like that. We don't have to add any meaning to that translation because it's using the word قُرِئَ. فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ, listen to it. وَانصِتُوا, and be silent. لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ, there is hope that you will receive his mercy. So the second instance is in Surah Al-Inshiqaq, chapter 84, verse number 21. And that one, in contrast to our discussion, is actually it's still a condition, but it's being stated in response to why a certain group is not from the mu'minun. So this ayah, actually, verse number 21 of Surah Inshiqaq, is one which has the recommended sajda upon completing its recitation. So inshallah, we won't read it now, but you guys are welcome to look it up. It was chapter 84, verse number 21. And this one is directly sort of in contrast to what the meaning that we're going through here of this verse. And it's interesting that here the pondering is included when they're talking about the mu'minun, and over there it's the opposite, when the pondering is not included in the meaning. It's just a recitation, and they're talking about basically the opposite, those who are not mu'minun. So in the interest of sticking to the verses we have undertaken explaining, let's go back to verse 2 of Surah Al-Anfal, inshallah. So we went through وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ, and the verse continues, عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ. Alayhim meaning them, and ayatuhu meaning his signs. Ayah, which is the singular of ayat, is commonly known as a translation of verse or signs. Sometimes, I guess you could see that the way that this is being translated, when we say وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ, and whenever it's recited and pondered upon, alayhim ayatuhu, it's sort of upon them, and then signs come. So this is sort of out of order a little bit, but it's for good reason. It puts emphasis on certain parts of the verse when for someone who's reading it in Arabic, and they understand when certain things come before or after. It's not just that they're out of order. It brings attention to the reader, and it puts emphasis on certain things. So here, when we say وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ, as whenever his signs are recited upon them, it's not just any recitation, but one which necessitates being pondered over. So this makes up the first excuse me. This makes up the first part of the condition, which follows إِذَا, and of the second trait, basically, that is being mentioned here in this ayah. It is sort of indicative of a cause for something. Ayat, basically, the signs they're always pointing to something, and signs, they're always pointing and conveying something, obviously, other than being a sign in and of itself. So there's always a message, something else which it is directing you toward. So one could say that each verse is a sign, kind of, because we use this sort of interchangeably for verses and signs, because all the verses they're pointing to something more than just the apparent, to something deeper. As there is a batin to each verse as well, seeing, understanding, experiencing that all of existence are his signs, is pointing and directing us towards his independence. So far, regarding the second trait of the mu'minun, we understand that a mu'min is someone who, when his verses, or when his subhanahu wa ta'ala verses or signs are recited or manifested upon him, he ponders over them. But that's not all. Remember, this is just the first part of our condition. Something has to occur after this pondering takes place as well. There's a change which must sort of manifest within the one who is pondering, which is mentioned in the continuation of this verse. Zadathum imana. So to grow or increase in their faith is how this would be translated. This is the second part of the condition of the trait being sort of connected to the mu'min here. So when his verses and signs are recited, regardless of who's doing the reciting, again, it's a passive version, tuliyat. Remember, it was the passive form of the verb that we use, so the who isn't important. It could be another person, it could be himself, it could be a mu'min, it could be anyone doing the reciting. That part is not important. What's important is that these verses are pondered upon, and through this pondering, they grow. How do they grow? Well, definitely not physically. You cannot ponder on a verse of the Holy Quran if you're interested in growing a few centimeters taller in order to serve your sort of worldly desires. The mu'min experiences an existential and essential growth within themselves. This iman sort of grows within them, within their ruh, and it's like a plant, which has a very strong and thick stem, which has been nourished through this action of pondering over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's signs, and it increases and flourishes such that it sort of eliminates the probability of it being uprooted. So the word iman itself comes from the root letters alif, mim, and nun, meaning to be safe. So here a link between safety and iman, and safety and faith, which are both meanings in the word iman, need to be pointed out. Iman or faith is not just like some sort of permanent dye that everlastingly colors the fabric of one's soul. Rather, it continues. It constitutes something that requires persistent maintenance and preservation. As long as we are nurturing and nourishing our iman through acts like pondering on his signs, which is one of them that we're discussing here, we're safeguarding our beliefs. So iman or faith is not something that emerges within the heart and just simply continues to remain there out of its own accord. Rather, we must constantly strive to keep it safe and alive within our souls. So it is like a two-way street, so to speak. Our iman safeguards us as long as we safeguard it. Should we refrain from upholding the traits of a mu'min, there will no longer be anything, any necessitation, anything to necessitate the preservation of our iman. To understand this, we can look, we do have a Quranic example of faith being taken away from those who previously possessed it. So in the interest of time, I'll just mention the translation, and it's basically from Surah Al-Rum, verse 10. It says, "Then the fate of those who committed misdeeds was that they denied the signs of Allah." So committing misdeeds here is basically the opposite of doing something that would safeguard your iman, and it leads to the weakening of one's faith, and the iman basically cannot safeguard that person anymore. Behaving immorally, acting in opposition to divine laws, sort of being heedless towards religious responsibilities, these things, they all gradually transform a faithful heart into one that can even reject the reality of God. So to preserve our faith, the Almighty, He orders us to be continuously on guard. He commands us to be sort of unceasingly attentive and to meticulously fulfill our religious obligations as ordained by Him. Being in such a state now is what we call having taqwa. We won't get too much into the word taqwa, it's not part of our discussion. You can translate it, I guess, as a God-cognizant piety. In short, basically the preservation of our faith is guaranteed by this righteously observant spiritual disposition. It should be noted that taqwa also definitely has other effects and benefits, but they lie beyond the scope of our current discussion. So moving on, وَعَلَى رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ, and upon their Lord do they rely. As Rabb, the word Rabb was previously covered for you guys in B1. We won't get into explaining it, as you can revise the points which were mentioned before, inshallah. As for wa'ala, and upon Rabbihim, obviously their Lord, do they rely? So this do they rely is what we're going to be talking about here, yatawakkalun. So most of you can likely pick up on the fact that this verb shares the same root letters as the word tawakkul. Some of these words have a lot of meaning in them, but inshallah, we won't get into all of the details. Just tawakkul in short is basically to place one's trust in and to depend on Allah as a result of that trust. The usage of this specific verb form indicates that this is something which basically it's continuously occurring within a mu'min. And this is the third trait of the mu'min being mentioned in this verse. Sorry, there was a few messages that came through. I think I'm just going to. So asking, is the reliance on Allah a result of increase in faith? So yeah, definitely. Like it'll definitely increase somebody's. It's a trait basically. The way that the verse is saying it is that this trait is something that necessitates a person being a mu'min, and being a mu'min necessitates having this trait. So these two things are definitely connected to one another, and because they're connected, it's not that this trait will basically it won't have any effect on the mu'min. It'll definitely have an effect. It'll have a good effect on the mu'min. It'll definitely increase them in their proximity to their Lord and in their faith, inshallah. So just a quick recap before handing it over of what we covered so far, inshallah. So from the beginning, we went through إنما المؤمنون الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم. So that was the first trait being linked back to the mu'minun. The second trait here, which is mentioned also in the same form of a condition, was وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا. And the third trait here, وَعَلَى رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ. So certainly the believers are, one, only those whose hearts tremble with awe whenever Allah is mentioned. Two, when his verses are recited to them or recited upon them, they increase their faith. And three, and upon their Lord do they rely. So this concludes the material for, basically it concludes verse 2 and the material for our session today. Inshallah, Brother Mujahid will be taking over now. Thank you for your time, and inshallah, we'll go through verse 3 next week. Assalamu alaikum.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وهو خير ناصر ومعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I don't know if you guys can hear me, if my voice is clear or not. If you guys can verify, or at least someone can verify if the voice is clear or not, please. Thank you.
We can hear you all.
Okay. So this session is basically a continuation of the pre-Ahkam course that was designed. I believe the A1 session was covered by Said Kamil. This session is a continuation of basically the discussion of understanding ourselves and the conditions for the laws to apply to the believer. There are three main discussions that are being covered in this session. So the three main discussions that are being covered in the session. One is the general understanding that we know that there is a criteria, there is a law that must be followed. Of course, we're not saying that we know what that law is, at least not at this stage. What we are claiming here is that we know that there is a law. We have a general understanding that there is a law. The second discussion that comes after this is the criteria of who does this law applies to. There are certain conditions that if one has and one fulfills those conditions, then the law is actually applied on them. This is the second discussion that we're going to be having in this session. And then the third discussion that follows after that is pertaining to our actions and the entire concept of turning off that autopilot mode that's been discussed, I think, since the beginning. So inshallah, we'll start with this first question or this first point. There is a criteria and there is a law. Before even getting into the discussion, there are certain points that were discussed in the previous sessions by Sayyid, and I'll just quickly go over some of these points. So the first point that's been discussed in the past in the previous session was that we have a nafs. Mankind has a nafs. The entire discussion has been done on it. So this is an established fact that we are taking, into consideration before we even get into the discussion of, what the discussion of criteria and the law and who is the law coming from, who is sending the criteria. The first discussion that we had is one second. Is the sound okay now? Is it better? But still very low. So I'll continue speaking. If it's low, then please message again. Okay, so like I said, the first discussion or under this discussion of criteria and law, there are a few points that we already discussed in the previous sessions. One of them, of course, is that we have a nafs. This has been established. We have gone through this in detail. The second discussion is about the purification of this nafs, and we have said that there is in order to understand the success and the failure of the nafs, there has to be a criteria on which we basically due to which we can figure out and understand if how the purification has taken place, if it has, and the level of purification that has taken place, and based on that, we can decide if the nafs is successful or has been successful or has failed. We also know from, again, the previous discussions that in order to, like I said, in order to verify or in order to judge the success or failure, I think there is an issue with the mic. So let me just switch on my phone then. So I'll join again through my phone.
Brother Mujahid is just signing on with the phone, inshallah. So thank you for your patience. Me and him tested out his sound card on his laptop yesterday. Last night it seemed fine, but today it's becoming really muffled and not very clear. So if you just have patience, inshallah, when he comes online with his phone, you'll have more clarity. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين الحمد لله رب العالمين. While Brother Mujahid is downloading Zoom on his phone and coming online, inshallah, there's just a few points that I really wanted to mention about understanding our nafs and help with the discussion that's been going on WhatsApp. So if you, the last question that I had asked was related to basically what happens when you undergo grief and how your intellectual faculty comes in. We were to think, how does it actually come from experience again, right? And take us out of those moments of grief. What are the roles of the other faculties in our life at that time? What do they push towards, and so on and so forth. So the example I gave was of grief, but a very similar thing tries to occur in times of great happiness as well. So when grief happens, or when great happiness happens, the faculties of desire or the faculty of anger, right? They quickly try to enact and take over the control of the person's actions, right? So the reason why this happens is because the person feels that they've lost something, right? In idea of grief, they feel that something has been taken away from them, they've lost something, right? Let's open that particular concept further. When you lose something, it means that you've assumed that you've had it before, that it was yours, right? That you were allowed or you were granted some sort of access to that particular thing, and now you've lost it. So in the case of, let's say, the death of loved ones, somebody's parents passing away, or them hearing about the passing of somebody they really loved, right? Then the grief stems from this solid belief that, well, that this is the end of the relationship with them, this is the end of the journey with them, and so on and so forth, right? Sometimes the grief stems from the manner in which they left the world. So for example, for say the shuhada, right? The grief that we feel is not only in the fact that this world was separated from his existence, apparent existence, such that they weren't able to benefit from the third Imam any longer. Rather, it goes beyond that into the fact that the way now in which that the separation took place was also something that was the greatest of tribulations and hardships. Okay. So, say the Shuhada, the way we mourn his loss, well, it comes out, it displays itself in our grief, not only because of the separation itself, but also the way in which we separated from him. Okay. This grief of separation is it stays with the person because, well, the person has been cut off from that particular person's existence in the apparent sense. But for the mu'minun, for the people who believe in a realm of existence beyond the physical, the people who believe in the realm of existence and interaction, even really beyond the realm of physical relationship, of physical realm, right? Their interaction and their benefit from and giving benefit to other people is not limited to just the physical realm, right? So in this particular regard, the mu'min also doesn't have this feeling of that I will never see person X, Y, or Z again, right? The capacity to meet them and to see them and so on and so forth, and to reunite with them if they are mu'mineen, right? It exists within our belief system. That it is not a goodbye and you'll never see them again. Rather, there is a chance of liqa, a chance of ziyarah possible, right? For individuals, so this is the point to consider. For individuals as great and as lofty as Imam Hussein, for example, or Sayyidah Fatima Masuma, or other great individuals, right? In this dunya, we can buy a ticket, get on a plane, go visit the zari of Imam Hussein, and that's about it. But in the hereafter, the visitation of such individuals isn't as easily done by us. Right? The visitation of such individuals isn't as easily done by us. So to be able to visit Imam Hussein in this dunya, perhaps we have the we have the chance of going and doing it right away. Like, we can get on a plane, go there, do ziyarah, and so on and so forth, and come back. Right? But when it comes to the ziyarah of Imam Hussein, let's say now in the akhirah, like, it's not an opportunity granted to everybody. There are differences now, right? In how you are able to interact with them. So now if a person who's truly mourning, let's say, the loss of their interaction with their imam or with their loved ones and so on and so forth, right? Then this should add as a motivation and as a strive towards them becoming good and becoming better. Because in their perfection of their nafs, they're granting themselves the capacity to reunite with their loved ones. If their loved ones are at a higher elevated spiritual state, right, then the capacity to reunite with them and do ziyarah for them, right, is linked to now the capacity of your nafs in that realm, which requires now the purification of your nafs. Well, I'm here because Brother Mujahid has come, but I'll continue the discussion on WhatsApp, inshallah. So the comment that's here, inshallah, I'll respond to that in the WhatsApp group. So I'll end here for now. Sallallahu alaihi Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Is it better now? Is it clear?
Yes, for me it's really crystal clear here.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, so okay, so going back to our discussion, so we said we are discussing three main points in the session. One is that there is a criteria, there is a law. The second discussion is about who does this criteria applies to, and the final discussion is about our actions and turning off that autopilot mode, a discussion that's been happening, I think, from day one since the session started. Now, going back to the first question, or going back to the first point of discussion, that there is a law. Of course, before establishing this and before having this general understanding that there is a law, there are a few prerequisites, or there is a prerequisite understanding that's required. And part of it, or some of it, has been discussed in previous sessions. So, for example, one of the major prerequisites is the understanding that mankind has a nafs. This has been established in previous discussions. Another understanding is that's also a prerequisite is the purification of the nafs is basically a criterion that based on which we decide the success or the failure of man. Right? This has also been discussed in the past. Another discussion that's also been done and it's been established as a prerequisite, and that is that to assess this success and failure, we need a set of criteria. Right? Up until here, the discussion's been done. Now, what follows from here is basically who should make this criteria? Where should this criteria come from? Can we come up with our own criteria or not? Or no, does the criteria has to come from the creator, right? Can creation make their own criteria or no? The creator has to play a role and has to send, number one, not just send the criteria, but also give us a path and tell us the way of understanding and knowing what the criteria is. So all these discussions are follow from this. I know in the previous session we discussed the sifat and the attributes of our creator. So this first question that we're trying to answer basically follows or is a continuation of the discussion from past week. So we said that our creator of mankind is, or one of his attributes is that he's an all-independent and perfect creator, right? So it only makes sense that the criteria should be coming from this creator, and it doesn't necessarily negate the fact that man cannot follow their own man-made criteria, but we have a general understanding that because our creator is a perfect all-independent creator, and because he's wise in what he does, we know that when he did the creation, this creation had a purpose and had a benefit. And we also know that because of the creator's perfection, this purpose and this benefit has to go back to the creation and not the creator. So we know this, right? And because like I said, because of him being wise, right, he has some sort of if he does the creation without any benefit in it, then this action is not considered a good action, or let's say a fail hasan, like call it. So based on this understanding, we can easily conclude to a certain degree that as creation, we have a general understanding and general knowledge and a general idea that the creator has to send some sort of a criteria where the benefit of this criteria actually goes back to the creation. The follow-up then question is, okay, if once the nafs has this general understanding, can we ignore this general understanding? Can we not go along with this general understanding? Can we say, okay, although on one side we have this understanding that the creator has to send a law and has to send a criteria, can we still ignore this understanding? Can we still come up with our own criteria? Right. So now here there's another, I would say, a secondary discussion which is equally important, and that discussion is about having hujjat, right? Now, of course, this is a terminology that needs to be opened up, and there's a lot of discussion that happens on this terminology and what hujjat is and where does it come from and what role does it play in our day-to-day life and whatnot. But let's say if we were to translate this terminology, it's basically having a reasonable argument in front of if we are questioned about something. Right? So on one side, let's say going back to our own discussion, we said we have a general understanding, or the mankind has a general understanding that there is a criteria, there is a set of laws that has to come from the creator. Now, if we decide to go against this general understanding, then we need a reasonable argument to go against this general understanding, right? A good example is basically, let's say if a professor in a university sets an exam date and announces the exam date and tells you that this exam date has been posted on a certain message board. Right. Now, of course, based on this information, as students, we know, or we have a general understanding that there is going to be an exam, number one, and number two, the date has been posted somewhere, and we already know where it's posted. It's posted on a message board. If we now, ignore this message from the professor, and if you decide not to show up on the exam or not to prepare for the exam, or if we tell the professor that we didn't know when the exam would be held, then of course this argument is not acceptable. It's not a reasonable argument in front of for the professor, right? It's we are going to be punished, in other words, or we are going to have to face the consequences of ignoring that general understanding that was given to us by the professor. So it's very similar to that, right? So on one side, like I said, on one side, we know we have a creator. We know this creator has certain attributes. For example, he's wise, he's all perfect, he's independent. We know that because of these attributes, any action that he does, for example, creating or the creation, has to have some sort of benefit. We know that this benefit also has to go back to the creation, right? We know all these things. We have a general understanding of all these things, right? Now, if we were to ignore this general understanding, then we need a reasonable argument to ignore this understanding, right? It's not as simple as saying that, I just didn't feel like it, right? Because, one of the discussion points that we can talk about on the group maybe is, why is that the case? Why can we not go against our general understanding of anything, for that matter? It's not just about this discussion. Is generally speaking, if we have a general understanding of something, Right? Why can we not go against it? Right? Why do we need a reasonable argument to go against our general understanding? So that's one of the questions that inshallah can be discussed, I think, on the group. Just because of time, I think this is not a good time to. We don't have enough time to do the discussion here, but I think it can be a discussion that can happen on the group, inshallah. So, anyways, so just to summarize this, the point number one, we need, like mentioned, we need a reasonable argument to go against this general understanding. If we don't have this argument, if we don't have a reasonable argument, right, to go against this understanding, then there is no option but to accept that, we have to now basically put an effort into finding out what this criteria is. Again, here in this discussion, the claim is not that we know what the criteria is. The claim is that we have a general understanding that there is a criteria. We need a criteria, right? That's what we are claiming. To go to disprove this claim or to go against this claim, we need a reasonable argument. If we don't have it, then we don't have a choice. It's a very it's a very clear argument that we don't have a choice but to go along with this general understanding. So that was point number one. And from this, we are basically trying to say, and we're trying to prove that there is a law, there is a criteria that our nafs or mankind has to follow. And based on this criteria, or based on how much of this criteria is followed, the success and failure of mankind is basically decided. So that was point number one. Point number two that we're discussing in this session. Again, I have access to chat on my phone. I'm using Zoom through my phone. So if you guys have any questions regarding this point, you can definitely mention here. We might not be able to go through these questions in this session just because of lack of time, the technical difficulties that I had. We can definitely go through these questions in the group afterwards, inshallah. Now, the second point that we're discussing here is who does this criteria applies to, right? This set of laws or this set of criteria that's been sent to us by the Creator. Who does this apply to? What conditions does one needs to have in order to basically say, okay, yes, this criteria now applies to me, and then this is followed now by action, which is the third point that we're going to discuss afterwards. So there are three main conditions that we know that we have that one needs to fulfill to basically conclude and understand and know that the criteria is now applied on them and they are responsible for following this criteria or this law. Condition number one is intellect. I'll just mention all these three conditions and then we'll go over them one by one. So condition one is intellect. Condition number two is qudrat or capacity, and condition number three is bulugh. We all know about like bulugh, the signs, the age of bulugh and whatnot. That entire discussion of bulugh that we have in our risalas is basically related to this third condition. Going back to condition number one, which is intellect. So as discussed, I think in previous sessions as well, basically intellect is the main and the primary tool for us to understand, the purpose of creation, this criteria in itself, right? It's the intellect that understands that, we need a criteria and whatnot, right? And it's this faculty of intellect that allows us to basically even, come to this conclusion that we have to follow or we have to obey our Creator, that we have to be servants, right? This entire understanding is coming from intellect. So if someone doesn't have this intellect, or someone is basically handicapped intellectually, if they're handicapped, then this law, this criteria is not applied on them, right? Now, what do we mean when we say intellect, right? Because there are so many definitions out there about intellect, but what do we mean by intellect in this discussion? And so here, basically, intellect means to be able to differentiate between, what is belief, what is not belief, what is just, what is corruption, what is wajib, what is haram, what is good, what is bad. Like understanding the good and the bad is like the most basic form of intellect. But at this stage in this discussion, it's slightly more than that. And it's also, like I said, the understanding of belief and disbelief and corruption, wajib, haram, and whatnot. So if someone is intellectually handicapped in this sense, right, then the criteria or the law that's been sent by the creator is not applied on them. Right? Again, there's also a side discussion here that, and we see evidence of this in our traditions, that if someone is intellectually handicapped, do they have a different set of criteria and a different set of laws or not? Right? And we see indications of this in our traditions as well. Okay, there is potentially a different set of criteria, a different set of laws for people who are intellectually handicapped in this sense that's been defined here. Again, this is a separate discussion, but it's something that we need to keep in mind, that, or we need to know this, that there has been there is a different set of laws and a criteria. So that was the first condition, having intellect. Second condition is about qudrat and capacity. Right now, again, it's also very clear. Our intellect basically tells this to us, that if someone doesn't have the capacity or the qudrat to follow the criteria, then based on their qudrat and their capacity, either the entire criteria or the law is basically doesn't apply on them, or no, the law or the criteria is then adjusted to match their capacity. And so it's very clear, and we know examples of these, and we see examples of this in our fiqh as well, in our current fiqh that we have. A very basic example is the example of salat and namaz. We know under normal circumstances that we have to pray, we have to stand and we have to pray while standing. And then we know if one is not feeling better, then they can sit, or when one is weak, then they can sit and they can pray. And if they get even weaker, then they can pray while lying down, and so on and so forth, right? So here we see how, based on one's qudrat and one's capacity, how the criteria is now being adjusted, right, based on the capacity and one's qudrat. So again, the second condition that one needs is qudrat and capacity to follow the criteria. The third condition is bulugh, or religious maturity. And, again, this is a fiqhi discussion, and I'm sure we have all gone through this discussion in our risalas. So again, there's the discussion of age, other signs of bulugh and whatnot. That entire chapter of bulugh in risala is pertaining to this third condition. So now, so based on this, we are saying that if we have someone who fulfills these three conditions, then the law or the criteria applies on them, right? So to sort of now tie this with our first point that we had mentioned, point number one, we said that we are nafs, or we have this general understanding, or this ilm, ijmalan, we have a general ilm that there is a law, it's been sent by the creator, right? This is step number one. Step number two, we know that as far as we are concerned, the conditions that are required to apply this law, we have these conditions. We fulfill these conditions. Therefore, we have to apply this law. We have to follow this law. Again, I'm going to sort of point towards this one more time. That claim here is not that we know what that law is, right? The claim here that we're making, that we know, generally speaking, that there is a law. And and then we have to follow that law. This is what we are claiming. Why do we have to follow that law? Because of the conditions that we fulfill. So this was step number 2, or point number 2 that we discussed. The last point of discussion here is now regarding our actions. So once we know that, once we know that we have to apply this law, then of course naturally, the follow-up discussion is about our actions. Now, as we know, again, from our risalas and from our Sunday schools and from other classes that we have attended, that generally speaking, our actions are divided into 5 categories. We have wajib actions, we have haram actions, we have mustahab, we have makruh, and then we have mubah. I think all we know these terminologies. If any of these terminologies are, if they're not clear for anyone, please send a question, or you guys can get clear either on WhatsApp or just send a question here. So now, so like I said, so our actions are now divided into 5 different categories, right? It's wajib, haram, makruh, mustahab, and mubah. So now that we know this, now that we know that, we have to now apply this law, and we have to apply this criteria, we cannot now be ignorant towards our actions, and we cannot be ignorant towards knowing which category or what sort of actions we are doing. We cannot, in other words, be in the autopilot mode, where we just go about our day without knowing what we are doing, which categories are our actions falling into. Are these actions now taking us closer to Allah, right? Or they are not? Because if we are attentive towards our actions, then we know, okay, this specific action is in line with that criteria and with that law that's been set by the Creator. And if I were to follow this, or if I were to do this action, then I would be getting closer to Allah. We need to be conscious towards this understanding. We need to be attentive towards this point. And we cannot now go about our day ignorant towards this fact, or completely in let's say the autopilot mode, right? Right. So if the purpose of creation is achieving that perfection, if the purpose of creation is not just achieving any perfection, is to achieve let's say the highest of levels, or to go as high as possible, right? If that's what the purpose is, then we have to be attentive towards our actions. Now I'm taking this entire discussion in basically I'm connecting this entire discussion to our point 1 now. So right, so like I said, so if the purpose of the creation is attaining perfection, then we have to be attentive towards our actions. Why do we have to be attentive towards our actions? Because if we are not, then we don't know, and we are not certain that we are following the criteria and that law that's been sent down by the Creator. Why is it important to know that we have to follow the law? It's important to know this because we already know that the law applies on us, right? This is already established. Why does the law apply on us? Because there are conditions that we fulfill, right? Due to which the law basically applies on us, right? So this entire discussion of having a law, the conditions of the law, and being attentive towards action is connected with one another, which helps us in understanding how to achieve perfection. What to do if we want to achieve perfection. Why should we not be ignorant towards our action? Why do we need that additional attention towards our actions, right? And why should we not just go about our day without this realization that what sort of impact our actions are having on us. There are, of course, a lot of other side discussions. For example, just to sort of give you some ideas. So like I said, right, the claim here is not knowing what the law is, right? Maybe, for example, and again, I think Brother Said Kamil can elaborate on this in, I think, next session or even on the WhatsApp group. Maybe the law is, that we should have our own laws, right? Maybe that's the law, right? But is that the case or not? Right? Maybe the Creator said, the law is that mankind should make their own laws. Right? So, but this is something that we need evidence for, and we need a reasonable argument. We need hujjat to basically say what the law is. That's why in this discussion, we're not saying what the law is. In this discussion, we are saying that there is a law, and that's about it. I believe as far as the session is concerned, I've went over all the points that I had planned to go over. If there are, we have, I believe, another, I think, 5 minutes or so. So if there are any questions, I don't see the chat window here. 1 second. Yeah. So if there are any questions that that you guys have, you can either write here or on the WhatsApp group. So we have 5 minutes to do some sort of any discussion that you guys would like. Or if you guys think there's more clarification required regarding any of these points, then please say so. So, yes, why does Allah want us to? So the question that came here is, why does Allah want us to reach perfection? Is it only for our own benefit? Again, I believe this was a discussion that happened last week as well. But again, just to elaborate on it, yes, because Allah is all perfect and all independent, right? The benefit has to come back to us only, right? If, let's say, if we were to accept that the benefit actually goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we are, in other words, we are suggesting or we are saying that there was some sort of imperfection in Allah, which was achieved by this benefit that was, that went back to him, right? Or that he got, right? So by saying that, the benefit, so in conclusion, because the result of saying that the benefit goes back to Allah, the result of accepting that if the benefit goes back to Allah is that there is imperfection in Allah, then we have to sort of conclude, or we conclude that the benefit only has to come back to us, and it doesn't have to go back to Allah, right? Because if it does, then we are, like I said, we, in other words, are saying that there is some level of imperfection in Allah, which is going away, or he's becoming more perfect by receiving this benefit, and we know that that's not the case. We have, I think, 2 more minutes. Any other questions, clarification? So basically, hujjat means having a reasonable argument. Well, having a reasonable argument in relation to your actions or to anything that you do, right? Now, so for example, if you know that this example that I gave during the session, so if you know, there is an exam date, right, which is posted on the message board, and if you were to ignore this information, if you were to not go along and if you didn't put any effort into finding out what this exam date is, and on the day of exam you tell your teacher or you tell your professor that I didn't know when the exam was, right, that's why I didn't prepare for it, right? So this is not a reasonable argument, right, for the professor, right? This having a reasonable argument, it basically means hujjat, having hujjat, right, where you can defend yourself, defend your actions that you did and actions that you did not do. You need a reasonable argument, or you need hujjat on both sides. So if you are doing an action, why are you doing it? Do you have a reasonable argument for that? Or if you're not doing an action, do you have a reasonable argument for that? So for example, in some cases, there is a conflict, for example, right? And it's happening in front of our eyes, and we decide to be quiet. We decide not to say anything, knowing that if we were to say something, it would make a positive difference, right? So this is important, right? So there's a conflict, we are aware of this conflict. We also know that if we were to say something regarding this conflict, it would make a positive difference. It would not create more chaos, for example, or it would not create more tension. We know this, right? If we decide to stay quiet, or if we decide not to do anything in relation to this conflict, then we need a reasonable argument for staying quiet, for not to say anything, right? Or on the other side, if we do decide to sort of say something, and if we do decide to confront, right, or if we do decide to address this conflict, even then we need a reasonable argument. What happened? Why did you decide to sort of speak up, right? In both cases, we need a reasonable argument. Having this reasonable argument basically means having hujjat, having some sort of dalil, some sort of I would say having some sort of dalil, or having a reasonable, let's say, an answer to what you did and why you did, and why you did what you did. So I think it's past 7 o'clock here, and I think the time for session is also complete. If you guys have any questions, you guys can definitely post them on the WhatsApp group, and inshallah we'll try to do a discussion there as well regarding this, having general understanding, and if you have other questions regarding hujjat and what that exactly means, and or if you want to go into a more deeper discussion of hujjat, then inshallah that can happen on the WhatsApp group as well, inshallah. All right, iltamas dua. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz.